Well, you know what you're getting because he's been practicing for a bit. And I don't think he'll change. You know, he is.
Something has gone seriously wrong with King Charles's health, and Princess Anne is the one who just confirmed it. Her update was careful, but the weight behind every word she spoke pointed to a crisis far deeper than the palace is letting the public know. When the most private royal in the family starts talking, you know the situation has passed the point of being manageable. And what she said next will make you question everything the palace has been telling you. The scare no one was supposed to know about.
My own schedule of cancer treatment can be reduced in the new year.
The British monarch's openness about his health has been unprecedented.
There are moments in the life of a monarchy when the wall of silence begins to crack. Not all at once, not with a bang, but in small, quiet fractures that careful observers cannot ignore. What happened with King Charles in the early weeks of 2025 was exactly that kind of moment. His schedule was quietly rearranged. Public appearances were postponed without detailed explanation. And a growing unease spread among those close to the institution. Something more serious was happening. Something the official line was not reflecting. King Charles had already shown unusual openness about his health by royal standards. When his cancer diagnosis was announced in February of 2024, it was treated as a rare moment of transparency from a family not known for personal candor. The palace chose its words carefully. They spoke of treatment, of optimism, of the king's determination to continue serving. And for a while, that framing held. Charles returned to public duties. He appeared at engagements. He was photographed looking well. The recovery narrative was being managed with precision, but managing a narrative and controlling reality are two very different things. By early 2025, the gap between those two things had begun to widen, and it was becoming harder to close. Reports began to surface from sources close to the household. The king had experienced a sudden and alarming episode, one that required immediate medical attention. The details were never confirmed by Buckingham Palace in any formal capacity. There was no announcement, no press briefing, no carefully worded statement of the kind that had accompanied the original cancer news. There was only silence, and that silence was loud. When the palace says nothing, it is rarely because there is nothing to say. Anyone who has followed this institution long enough knows that. The quiet that followed this particular episode was the kind that generates far more questions than any statement ever could. Engagements were shifted without clear explanation. Aides gave vague assurances to press contacts. Senior courtiers, who are usually available for background conversations, became suddenly unreachable. And the story began to move the way stories about the royal family always eventually move when the palace tries to suppress them. It moved through whisper networks, through royal correspondents comparing fragments of information, through sources in medical and household circles who could not go on record but could not stay entirely quiet either. What those fragments pointed to was not a minor setback. This was not a routine fluctuation in the health of a man already undergoing cancer treatment. What people were describing was something that had alarmed those closest to the king, something that had pushed the inner circle of the palace into a state of quiet emergency. Schedules were not just adjusted, they were stripped back significantly. The king's public visibility was reduced in a way that went beyond what routine medical management would typically require. And the people who would normally be out front offering reassurance were nowhere to be found. Now here is where it gets interesting. Royal watchers have seen this pattern before. They saw versions of it with King George VI in the early 1950s. They saw echoes of it when the late Queen's health began to decline in 2022. The palace has a well-practiced method for managing the story around a monarch's deteriorating health. You reduce the schedule gradually. You frame each reduction as temporary. You keep the public appearances optimistic in tone, even when they are brief. And you say as little as possible for as long as possible. That method was clearly in operation here. But something was different this time. This time, the strategy was not holding as cleanly as it usually does. The people around Charles were not presenting a unified front. There were contradictions between what different sources were saying. There were gaps in the timeline of events that did not add up. And there was a sense, among those watching closely, that the institution was managing a situation that had moved faster and turned more serious than anyone had been prepared for. One senior royal correspondent described the atmosphere in palace circles during this period as one of controlled anxiety, not panic, but the kind of sustained tension that comes from people who know more than they are allowed to say and are working very hard to look like they do not. That description matters, because it tells you something important about where things stood before Anne spoke. The palace wanted containment. They wanted the story managed on their terms and their timeline. They wanted the public to receive information in the carefully measured doses that the institution has always preferred. Controlled, structured, optimistic where possible, vague where necessary. What they did not want was for a senior member of the royal family to step outside that structure. And yet, that is exactly what happened. Before we get to Anne's words, it is worth sitting with that fact for a moment. The palace's entire communication strategy in a moment of royal health crisis depends on everyone inside the family staying inside the lines. It depends on unity of message, on discipline, on the understanding that individual royals do not freelance when the institution is under pressure. Anne has always understood that better than almost anyone. She has lived by it for decades. So, when she chose not to follow it this time, the question that immediately demanded an answer was simple. Why now? What had she seen? What did she know? And what had pushed the most disciplined and private senior royal in the family to the point where staying silent was no longer something she was willing to do? Those questions did not have easy answers. But what makes this story even more unsettling is not just that Anne spoke, it is what she revealed when she did. Because buried inside her carefully chosen words was a detail so specific and so alarming that it stopped royal insiders cold the moment they heard it. And that detail tells you exactly how serious the king's situation truly is. Anne steps forward. Princess Anne does not do interviews. She does not sit across from a journalist and talk about her feelings. She does not release personal statements when the family is under pressure. She does not use the media as a tool the way some members of the royal family have learned to do. Anne has spent her entire public life operating on one simple principle. You show up, you do the work, and you do not talk about what happens behind closed doors. That is not just her personality, it is her identity. So, when word began to circulate in late March of 2025 that Anne had spoken openly about the king's condition, the reaction among royal watchers was not just surprise, it was an alarm. Because people who know Anne know what it means when she breaks from that pattern. It does not happen casually. It does not happen without reason. And it does not happen unless the situation has reached a point where silence itself has become a problem. The setting was not a formal press conference. Anne did not call journalists together and read from a prepared statement. That is not how she operates. What happened was something far more telling. She was attending an engagement in her capacity as a working royal, the kind of routine public duty she has carried out thousands of times over the course of her life, when she made remarks that went beyond the usual pleasantries. Remarks that were heard by multiple people in the room. Remarks that were, within hours, being quietly relayed to royal correspondents, who understood immediately that what they were hearing was significant. Anne spoke about the king with a directness that caught people off guard. She acknowledged that his situation was serious. She did not dress it up. She did not reach for the comfortable language of optimism that the palace communications machine had been deploying for months. She said, in terms that left little room for interpretation, that the family was navigating an extremely difficult period, that the demands on everyone around the king had intensified considerably, and that the road ahead was not going to be straightforward. Now, read those words carefully. Because on the surface they sound measured, diplomatic even, but placed in context, placed against the backdrop of everything that had been happening behind palace walls, those words were extraordinary. Here is why. When a senior royal uses the phrase extremely difficult period in reference to the king's health, they are not reaching for a casual description. They are using the most direct language available to them within the constraints of their position. Anne knows exactly what she is saying when she says something. She always has. Every word is chosen. Every phrase is deliberate. And when she says the road ahead is not going to be straightforward, she is telling you something real about what she knows and what she has seen. Royal insiders understood that immediately. The correspondents who received those words understood it too. But there was something else Anne said that went even further. Something that moved the conversation from difficult to genuinely alarming. She made reference to the speed at which things had changed. She spoke about how quickly circumstances had shifted around the king in recent weeks. And she used a phrase that one source described as stopping the room. She said that the family had been reminded in the most direct possible way that nothing about this situation could be taken for granted. Nothing about this situation could be taken for granted. Think about what that means coming from Anne. This is a woman who has stood beside the monarchy through decades of crisis. She was there through the turmoil of the 1990s when the institution nearly tore itself apart. She was there through the years of relentless media pressure. She was there when her mother's health declined, and the end came with the kind of sudden finality that shook the entire country. Anne has seen this family navigate things that would have broken most institutions. She does not reach for language like that lightly. When she says nothing can be taken for granted, she is not being poetic. She is being precise. And the people who heard her knew it. What followed in the hours and days after those remarks became public within insider circles was a period of intense activity. Royal correspondents began making calls. Sources who had previously been guarded became slightly more willing to share fragments of what they knew. And a picture began to emerge that was considerably darker than anything the palace had been willing to put on record. The king's health episode had not been a contained incident with a clean resolution. It had been serious enough to trigger a review of his entire schedule going forward. Serious enough that conversations had begun, carefully and quietly, about contingency planning at the highest levels of the institution. And serious enough that the people closest to Charles were no longer speaking about his recovery in the confident terms they had used through much of 2024. That shift in language among insiders was its own kind of signal. There is another dimension to Anne's decision to speak that deserves attention. Because this was not just about the king's health in isolation. When Anne made those remarks, she was also, whether intentionally or not, drawing attention to something that had been building inside the institution for some time. Attention. A question about how the monarchy was going to function in the event that the king's capacity to carry out his duties became more significantly limited. That question had been sitting in the background for months. People had been thinking about it, planning around it quietly, but no one at the senior level of the royal family had given it a public voice, until Anne did. And once she gave it a voice, once she put words to the reality that the family was in a serious and uncertain moment, something shifted in the public conversation around the monarchy that could not easily be shifted back. The palace had been working very hard to project stability, to reassure the public that the institution was functioning, that the king was engaged, that the working royals around him were managing the load. Anne's words did not destroy that narrative entirely, but they complicated it in ways that were immediately visible to anyone paying attention. Because if things were as managed and as stable as the palace wanted people to believe, then Anne would not have spoken. She spoke because things were not that stable. And now the question that was impossible to avoid was this. If the king's inner circle was already stretched, already strained, already navigating a situation more serious than the public had been told, then what exactly was happening inside the palace that was pushing the institution toward a breaking point nobody wanted to name out loud? The answer to that question goes deeper than most people realized. And it starts with a fracture that had been forming inside the royal family long before this health scare ever happened. The palace fracture. Every institution has a breaking point. Most of the time, that breaking point does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a dramatic moment or a single defining event. It builds slowly, quietly, through accumulated pressure and unresolved tension and decisions that get deferred because the cost of making them feels too high. What was happening inside Buckingham Palace in the months surrounding King Charles's health scare was exactly that kind of slow build. And by the time Anne spoke, she is telling you something real about what she knows and what she has seen. The correspondents who received those words understood it too. The fracture that had been forming beneath the surface of the institution was no longer something that could be smoothed over with careful messaging and well-managed public appearances. It had become structural. To understand what that fracture looked like, you have to go back a little. Not far, but far enough to see the pattern. When Charles became king in September of 2022, he inherited an institution that was already under enormous strain. The late queen had held the monarchy together through the sheer force of her consistency and her longevity. Her presence had been the stabilizing constant around which everything else in the institution organized itself. When she was gone, that constant disappeared overnight. And what was left was a family that was still processing its own internal divisions, while simultaneously being asked to project unity to the world. Charles came to the throne with a clear vision for what he wanted the monarchy to look like: a slimmed-down institution, fewer working royals carrying a more focused set of responsibilities, greater efficiency, a sharper public purpose. He had been thinking about this for years, planning for it, and in the early period of his reign, he moved with quiet determination to put that vision into practice. But a slimmed-down monarchy depends entirely on the people at its center remaining healthy, present, and fully functional, and that is where the plan began to come apart. First came the cancer diagnosis in early 2024. Then came the news that the Princess of Wales was also dealing with a serious health situation of her own. Two of the most visible and load-bearing members of the working royal structure were suddenly unavailable for significant periods. The weight that had been distributed across the institution began to concentrate on a smaller and smaller number of people, and the strain of that concentration began to show. Prince William stepped up. That much was visible to anyone watching. He took on more engagements. He appeared in contexts that would previously have been covered by his father or his wife. He carried more of the public-facing work of the monarchy, with a deliberateness that suggested he understood the gravity of what was being asked of him. But William stepping up created its own set of complications. Because William stepping up is not a neutral act inside the royal family, it is a statement about succession, about readiness, about the shifting of gravity within the institution from one generation to the next. And while that shift may have been inevitable, the speed at which it was happening, driven not by design but by medical necessity, created tensions that no one had fully prepared for. There were questions inside the institution about decision-making, about who was directing what, about how much of the day-to-day management of the monarchy had effectively passed from Charles to the people around him. Some of those questions were practical. Others were political, in the way that everything inside a royal household is ultimately political, and the answers to those questions were not always comfortable. Sources close to the household described a period in early 2025 where the lines of authority inside the palace were less clear than they had ever been during Charles's reign. Decisions that would normally have gone through the king directly were being handled at a remove. Communications that would typically have carried his personal stamp felt more institutional, more managed, less like they were coming from a man fully in command of his own house. That shift was noticed, inside the palace and outside it, and it fed directly into the anxiety that was building around the question of what the monarchy would look like if Charles's condition continued to deteriorate. Now, add Anne into this picture. Anne's role within the royal family has always been that of the steady, unglamorous backbone of the institution. She does not seek the spotlight. She does not position herself for influence in the way that others have, but she watches everything. She has been inside this institution her entire life. She understands its rhythms and its pressure points with a depth of knowledge that very few people alive can match. And what she was watching in early 2025 was an institution under a level of internal stress that she had not seen since the darkest years of the 1990s. That context is essential for understanding why she spoke. Anne did not step forward because she wanted attention. She stepped forward because she was watching something happen that she felt could not be allowed to continue without someone inside the family giving it an honest voice. The managed optimism coming from the palace was not just inadequate in her view, it was actively creating a gap between what the institution was saying and what the institution was experiencing. And that gap, left unaddressed, had the potential to do serious long-term damage to the credibility of the monarchy at exactly the moment when credibility was most needed. She was not trying to undermine the palace communication strategy. She was trying to inject a dose of reality into a conversation that had drifted too far from the truth. But the consequence of her speaking was that it exposed something the palace had been working very hard to keep contained. The fracture was not just about the king's health. It was about the question of who was really running the institution and how sustainable the current arrangement actually was. William's position in all of this was particularly complex. He is the heir. The future of the monarchy rests with him more completely than it has rested with any Prince of Wales in living memory. He knows that. The people around him know it. And the situation his father's health had created meant that he was being asked to embody that future at a pace and in circumstances that no one had anticipated. Those close to William described him during this period as focused but carrying a visible weight. He was not stumbling. He was not retreating. But the pressure of standing at the center of an institution in crisis while also managing his own family and his own concerns about his father's health, was a burden that left marks. And within that pressure, there was a dynamic between William and the palace establishment around his father that was not always smooth. William has his own instincts about how the monarchy should communicate, his own views about transparency and public trust. Those views do not always align perfectly with the older instincts of the courtiers and advisors who have shaped the palace's communications culture over decades. Those tensions were not new, but Charles's health crisis had sharpened them considerably, because when an institution is under real pressure, the disagreements that were manageable in calmer times become fault lines. And the fault lines inside the palace in early 2025 were more visible than they had been in a very long time. Anne could see all of it. She had watched this family navigate crisis before. She knew what a manageable, difficult moment looked like, and she knew what a genuinely dangerous one felt like. And what she was seeing in early 2025 felt genuinely dangerous, not just because of what was happening with the king's health, but because of what his health crisis was revealing about the deeper vulnerabilities of an institution that had been operating on the assumption that it had more time than it actually did, more time to plan, more time to prepare, more time to manage the transition from one reign to the next in a way that was orderly and controlled and projecting the kind of stability that the monarchy has always depended on for its relevance and its survival. That assumption had just been shattered. And what came next would test the royal family in ways that even the most seasoned observers had not fully anticipated. Because the real question was no longer about Charles's health alone. It was about whether the institution he had spent his entire life preparing to lead could hold itself together, while the man at its center was fighting to hold himself together. And the answer to that question was far from certain. What comes next for the crown? There is a question that nobody inside the palace wants to ask out loud. Not the courtiers, not the senior advisors, not the communications teams who spend their days carefully constructing the language that the institution presents to the world, and certainly not the royal family itself. But the question is there. It has been there for months, and King Charles's health scare, and everything that followed it, has made it impossible to keep pushing it to the back of the room. The question is this: what does the monarchy look like if Charles cannot fully come back? It is not a question about whether he will survive. It is a question about capacity, about function, about the day-to-day reality of running an institution that depends on its figurehead being present, engaged, and visibly active in a way that commands both domestic confidence and international respect. A king who is present but diminished is a different kind of problem than a king who is absent. And the situation developing around Charles in the early months of 2025 was pointing toward precisely that kind of complexity. The people around him were not talking about abdication. That word was not in circulation in any serious way. The British monarchy does not reach for abdication easily. The abdication of King Edward VIII in 1936 left a wound on the institution that took generations to heal, and Charles himself has spent his entire adult life preparing for this role. The idea that he would walk away from it voluntarily is not consistent with everything that is known about who he is and what the crown means to him personally. But there is a significant distance between abdication and full active monarchy. She is telling you something real about what she knows and what she has seen. Royal insiders understood that immediately. The correspondents who received those words understood it too. And it was in that distance that the real questions were gathering. A monarch who attends fewer engagements, who delegates more, who is seen less frequently in the kind of sustained public activity that builds the ongoing relationship between the crown and the people it serves. That is not an abdication, but it is a diminishment. And a diminishment, managed poorly, can do as much damage to the institution over time as a more dramatic rupture. The palace knew this. William knew this. And Anne, with her decades of institutional knowledge and her unflinching habit of looking directly at difficult realities, knew this perhaps better than anyone. What Anne had recognized, and what her remarks had quietly signaled to those paying attention, was that the monarchy was entering a period that required a fundamentally different kind of honesty than it had been practicing. The strategy of managed optimism that had served the institution reasonably well through the initial phase of Charles's illness was no longer adequate for the situation that was actually unfolding. The public was not being served by vague reassurances. the institution was not being served by them either. And the longer the gap persisted between the official narrative and the lived reality inside the palace, the more damage it was capable of causing. Anne's intervention, quiet and indirect as it was a call for a different approach. Whether that call would be heard was another matter entirely. The challenge facing the monarchy in this moment was not simply logistical. It was not just a question of redistributing engagements or adjusting the schedule of public appearances. It was a deeper question about identity, about what the institution stands for and how it demonstrates that in a period when its central figure is not able to carry the full weight of the role. William and Catherine, as they had shown repeatedly over the preceding months, were capable of carrying significant load. They had done it with professionalism and with a public presence that commanded genuine respect. The Wales household had become, in a very real sense, the most visible and active face of the working monarchy. And that visibility had translated into something valuable: public confidence, engagement, a sense that the institution was not standing still, even as it navigated serious internal challenges. But William and Catherine carrying the monarchy is not the same as the monarchy functioning as designed. It is a workaround, a capable and impressive one, but a workaround nonetheless. And workarounds have limits. They create pressures of their own. And they raise questions, not hostile ones, but legitimate ones, about the long-term shape of the institution and how honestly it is communicating with the people whose support it depends on. Those questions were becoming more urgent by the week. There was also the matter of the broader royal working group, the handful of senior royals who carry out the engagements and the representative duties that the institution depends on to maintain its presence across the country and around the world. That group had already been reduced. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex had departed. Prince Andrew had been removed from public duties. The working royal pool was thinner than it had been at any point in recent memory. And now, with Charles operating at reduced capacity, the strain on the people who remained was becoming genuinely acute. Anne was feeling that strain personally. She had always carried an extraordinary workload. Year after year, the statistics confirmed what people who watched her closely already knew. She consistently topped the rankings of royal engagements completed. She traveled relentlessly. She showed up in places and for causes that received no glamour and no headlines. She did the work because she believed in the work. But even Anne had limits, and the situation in early 2025 was pushing against those limits in ways that were visible to the people around her. The concern was not just about the present moment. It was about sustainability, about what the monarchy was going to look like not just in the next 6 months, but in the next several years. Because Charles's health situation, whatever its precise trajectory, had introduced a level of uncertainty into the long-term planning of the institution that had not existed before. And uncertainty at the top of a monarchy does not stay contained. It radiates outward. It affects morale. It affects decision-making. It affects the confidence of the institution in itself. And that is perhaps the deepest concern of all. The British monarchy has survived for as long as it has not, because it has been perfect. It has survived because it has been resilient, because it has found ways to adapt to circumstances that threaten to overwhelm it, because at critical moments there have been people inside the institution willing to face difficult realities honestly and make the hard decisions that stability requires. Anne was trying to be one of those people now. Her remarks were not a cry of despair. They were not a signal of collapse. They were the act of a woman who loves the institution she has given her life to, looking at a moment of genuine danger and refusing to pretend it was something less than it was. Whether the institution around her was ready to match that honesty remained the open question. What was certain was that the coming months would be defining ones, for Charles, for William, for the working royals carrying the load, and for the monarchy itself. The road ahead, as Anne had said, was not going to be straightforward, and the people who would travel it were going to need something more than carefully managed messaging and optimistic press briefings to get through it. They were going to need the kind of honest reckoning with reality that Anne had just, in her quiet and deliberate way, tried to begin. Whether that reckoning would come in time to make a difference was the question that no one inside the palace could yet answer with confidence. And it was the question that the rest of the world was now watching very closely indeed. King Charles is still standing, but the cracks in the palace wall are no longer invisible. Anne has done what she rarely does. She told the truth. And now the monarchy faces a defining test. Whether it meets that test with honesty or retreats into silence will determine everything that comes next.